IVM.
Hi, everybody. Just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Siddharth Bhatia. School children are taught that Kabir was a weaver poet from the 15th or 16th century and that he wrote dohas, that he spoke of unity and harmony and offered simple wisdom about love. And when he died, Hindus and Muslims both claimed him. One wanted to cremate him and the other bury him. Apart from that, very little details were given to the average student. But Kabir was, of course, much, much more than that. He was a prominent poet of the Bhakti movement, one which angered the Brahmin orthodoxy. And in fact, his dohas go much beyond what is widely known. Purushottam Agrawal has been interested in, one might say, obsessed with Kabir since his student days in JNU. Kabir was the subject of his PhD dissertation, and he has already written one book in Hindi on Kabir's poetry. His new book, Kabir Kabir, takes his research much further and squarely places him as the voice of modernity and as somebody who wrote in everyday language instead of in Sanskrit or Persian, which the elite used. As such, he was the voice of the people. In this interview, he tells us why Kabir is not only just significant, but also relevant to our times. Welcome to the Wire Talks, Purushottam Agrawal.
Thank you. Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you very much.
How did your interest in Kabir begin? How did it start?
Well, I had been interested right since childhood about, one should say, unchildlike questions. The questions about the meaning of life, the questions about what happens after this life. And by, I came in contact with left-wing activism, democratic activism. And my queries also started developing about the society I saw around myself. So this peculiar, admixture of social concern and spiritual anxiety went on developing, and it took me to various experiments, various directions. And finally, in the meanwhile, I think in North India, every average Hindi-speaking family knows a bit about Kabir right since beginning. It's like, as Ramanujan said, that no Indian listens to the Ramayana and Mahabharata for the first time. It's always a second time. So I knew in that sense, I knew about Kabir, but I started discovering him properly and studying him properly only in 1977. With the background, as I told you, about of spiritual anxiety as well as social concerns, Kabir attracted me a lot because he is one person who is categorical about it, that you cannot ignore either of these. To quote him, भीतर कहूं तो जग में लाजे, बाहर कहूं तो झूठा लो, मैं कई विधि कथों गंभीर आलू, भीतर बाहर शब्द निरंतर, मैं ए विधि कथों गंभीर आलू. So the profound realization of truth is neither confined to outside, nor it is confined to your inner voice. It has to be a constant interaction between your existential sense and your social surroundings. So this is how I got more and more interested in Kabir, and starting from Kabir, I got interested in the entire phenomenon of Bhakti movement in Hindi and then later on in other Indian languages. And as I have argued in my book, now I look at Bhakti as the expression of what I call vernacular modernity, and Kabir as its one of the best representatives and exponents.
We'll come to the modernity and modernism part a little later. But first, I wanted to, this must have, when you went finally to university, you saw an opportunity perhaps to explore it much, much further. And as you write, you had great teachers, many teachers who were directly and through another person connected to studying Kabir. So it made your task not easier, but certainly more, it was a helpful situation. So you spoke to them, those teachers, those masters of Kabir, Bhakti movement, and in your PhD, you then pursued it. So in a sense, it was inevitable, wasn't it?
Yeah, in a sense,
That you should. And what did you find during the PhD?
Yeah, as I told you, I joined JNU as a student of post-graduation MA in 77. And in the first semester itself, I had become clear that I'll do my PhD about Kabir. So in 79, I started working for my PhD dissertation under the supervision of legendary scholar Professor Nambar Singh. And I think in 84 or 85, I submitted my PhD. Namarji was quite happy with the thesis and he wanted it to be published immediately, and so was my friend Hindi publisher, leading Hindi publisher. He was also Ashok Maheshwari. He was also very insistent on getting it published. But Siddharth, interestingly, by the time I finished my thesis, I came to realize that certain things which we take for granted in our research about the so-called medieval India, those certain things in itself are problematic. To give you an example, like every thesis, my thesis also contains the first chapter as review of literature. And the title of this chapter in Hindi was Kabir ke Adhyan ki Samasyaएं. It was essentially a review of literature chapter. And the first book or first text it mentioned about Kabir as a commentary or whatever was some British Orientalist of 1810 who wrote about Kabir in the context of writing about Sikhism. When I finished my thesis, I had come to this conclusion that people were writing about Kabir even before that. They were just not mentioning him as Abul Fazl did, but they were writing treatises, they were debating about his ideas, there were sharp polemics about his ideas. All this was being conducted in Hindi, in his own language. And the modern scholarship hardly takes any notice of it. This is just one example to give you that what kind of dissatisfaction I was feeling with my thesis as it was in 1985. Then I also realized that in the history of literature, Kabir belongs to history. But in real life, he belongs very much to present. He is not merely a part of history, as a poet or as a saint or as a spiritual seeker or whatever. He is not merely a part of history, and also he is not merely a part of the contemporary urban or metropolitan secular discourse. There are millions of Kabir Panthis, and practically every sect which is inspired or influenced by any Nirgun Panthi Bhakt poet, Dadu Pant, Jagjivan Dasij, even Sikh religion to some extent, they all are inspired by Kabir. So his presence continues to be a contemporary presence. This changed my perspective fundamentally. And I did not publish my thesis. I continued to work, and I published my research in the book form on Kabir only after 32 years after I have started working. I started working in 77 and I published my work in 2009 so that I could make it as holistic as possible, touching upon various issues, touching upon the indigenous and vernacular tradition of reflections on Kabir, starting from Ram Rahesh Sahab to Nirvan Sahab and so on. So I realized that we look at Kabir and other Bhakti poets in a very limited, or even I would say distorted way. That needs to be corrected.
Does traditional scholarship, especially in English during colonial times and even after, do justice to Kabir, or does it treat him as a minor figure?
I think it will be rather simplified to make a generalization about this. But if we look at the so-called British Orientalists, many of them were fine scholars and many of them were actually administrators plus scholars. Nobody could have ignored Kabir totally. Because if you look at these early scholars, they were interested in history or literature of Indian people because they wanted to rule. They wanted to familiarize themselves with the traditions, mentalities, and languages of these people. So everybody took notice of Kabir for the simple reason that, as one of them, William Crook, put it in 1896, that in North India, you can hear Kabir or Tulsidas from almost everyone in the street. So such a person could not have been ignored. But not many of them could actually realize the real significance of Kabir. For example, one of the early scholars, Wilson, even doubted the existence of historical Kabir. He thought maybe this is a takhallus, and this is the word he used himself, takhallus. This is a word used by Wilson. He thought that Kabir maybe is a takhallus of so many free thinkers. There probably was no Kabir in history, which is not true. Secondly, when they started looking at Kabir or Bhakti poetry as such, most of them continued to suffer from a very peculiar internalization about the literary and cultural traditions of India. That was that if you know Sanskrit and if you know Persian, then hardly anything else matters. Everything else is either a translation or a rehash or just a representation. My fundamental argument, Siddharth, is precisely this, that vernacular languages, they do not exist in vacuum, of course. They interact with Sanskrit, they interact with Persian, but this is not a one-way interaction. It is not as if Sanskrit is influencing vernacular and not the vice versa. Only recently, Harbans Mukhia has published an excellent article arguing that the kind of philosophical speculations, the kind of search for a non-denominational religiosity, as he puts it, you find in Abul Fazl. Harbans Mukhia argues that it is actually inspired by Kabir. So the Persian intellectuals, the Sanskrit intellectuals, they were not merely influencing, they were also getting influenced. One. Secondly, the vernacular intellectual sphere, the vernacular wisdom was producing its own very fresh ideas, very original postulates, which have been mostly ignored. My entire argument, my entire attempt is precisely to give vernacular wisdom and vernacular tradition its historical due. And this is not merely a problem with British or European scholars. As you know, when you develop a tradition of scholarship, certain things become commonsensical. So this is one of them, that Sanskrit is original, rest is just translation or reproduction. It's not the case. Yeah.
Kabir's poetry and what he was saying must have been a challenge to the Brahminical establishment.
Siddharth, let us look at his historical context. This was 15th, 16th century, and this was a time where, because of various historical factors, there was a rise of commerce and mercantile activities. The rise of commerce implied the rise of commodity production and urbanization. So, as it happens throughout the world, if you look at the history of world, there is a kind of inherent contradiction between the attitudes prevalent in a feudal, restricted society and the desires and ambitions of, vyaparis, the merchants, artisans who want to go out, who want to look at things, and who want to find new markets for not only for their goods, but also for their ideas. So Kabir represented, or Kabir became popular primarily initially amongst artisans and people associated with various kind of trade activities. Now, these activities were in any case conducted in the people's language of the time. It was only the official activities of a state which were conducted in Persian, or the ritualistic activities which were conducted in Sanskrit, or in case of Muslims, Arabic and Persian. So it was very natural for Kabir, and like him, Bhakts like him, even Tulsidas, who was, socially speaking, did not have a progressive bent of mind, he wrote his classic and other works, Ramcharitmanas and other works, in people's language. And unlike Kabir, he was a scholar of Sanskrit. In his case, it was not kind of compulsion. In his case, it was a matter of choice. Just as it was a matter of choice in case of Gyaneshwar in Marathi or Eknath, they all were very well versed in Sanskrit, but they made it a point to write in the local language. They write in the vernacular of the area. People like Kabir in any case had no Sanskrit or Persian. It was a kind of compulsion, it was a kind of given for them to write in the language or speak in the language of people. And people could connect with them. So far as the establishment is concerned, whether Hindu or Muslim, they were perturbed and they felt challenged, not merely because of the language, but because of the content. See, a sadhu called Anant Das wrote a biography of Kabir around the turn of 16th century, maybe in 1599 or maybe in 1600. In that biography, which is known as Kabir Parchai, he describes a scene where the Hindus or the leaders of Hindus and Muslims of Banaras go together in a joint delegation to Sikandar Lodi to complain against Kabir. And the crux of the complaint is that he criticizes Hindu traditions, he criticizes Islam, he asks and encourages people to think rationally and not to just go by the scriptural words or by the instructions of priests. The crux of the complaint is, Jab lag Julaha Kasi hoi, tab lag hame na mane koi. As long as this weaver lives in Kasi, nobody is going to listen to us. So please throw him out of Kasi. So it was the content. It was basically his insistence to look at your experience in a rational way, to draw your conclusions from your experiences in a rational way. It was from this perspective that his most disturbing questions arose, For example, if you think that you are more pious or purer just because of the accident of birth, you happen to be a Brahmin, I happen to be a non-Brahmin or lower caste, then please tell me, do you have milk in your veins? Or if it is just blood, just as it is in my veins, then the criteria of judging your and my worth should not be birth. It should be your acts, it should be your achievements. So this was the fundamental questions which could not be answered in any rationalizing way, in any scholastic fashion. You can justify everything. In Islam, you can justify the division between Mu'min and Kafir. But for a rationality rooted in experience, that justification will not do. And that is why Mullah will feel angry with Kabir. Any justification for untouchability will not do at the level of experiential rationality. So those with a vested interest in untouchability will feel angry with Kabir. And that is why they maintain that as long as this man is around, nobody is going to listen to us. So anger was not caused merely by language, but by the content.
Bhakti poetry, both by Kabir and by others, raised questions about the many beliefs of religion as propagated by the clergy, not just of Hinduism, but also Islam.
Let me just underline one fact again. It was not merely the traditional order of Brahmanism. The beauty of Kabir and people like him lies in the fact that they were not opposing anything just for the sake of opposition. I look at this thing. I am making a statement and I find that there are certain things which go contrary to my experience, my wisdom, and I criticize them. So you should actually focus on the statement as such, not merely on the opposition which I have chosen to attack. So let us try to look at what Kabir and people like him are trying to say. All their social critique follows from there. And this social critique does not give any soft corner to anybody. In fact, there is a very one famous Saki of Kabir in which he clearly distinguishes himself from all three major religious traditions available to him. That is Hinduism, a particular part of this known as Nathism, and Islam. And he says, Hindu Ram Ram kare, Jogi Gorakh Gorakh uchchare, Musalman ka ek khudai, Kabir ka Swami rahya sabai. So Hindu and Ram here is reference to, idol and all that avatar, incarnation thing. Otherwise, Ram is the most favorite word for Kabir also. So Hindu worships or believes in a certain way. For Jogi, the Gorakh is most important. Musalman believes in monotheism. Kabir distinguishes himself even from Islamic kind of monotheism. Because he says that no, it's not as if God is away from creation. God is creation itself. Kabir ka Swami rahya samay. So there is, in a sense, he is saying that there is no God outside creation. There is no God outside universe. And at many places he says so. So Siddharth, I would request you and all others who are listening to this, let us try to look at what Kabir is actually saying instead of focusing what he is criticizing. Because if you know what he is saying, then you will understand the rationale of his criticism. He is criticizing Islamic ideas, he is criticizing Hindu or Brahminical ideas, he is criticizing Nath ideas, he is criticizing everything. But why? What is the point of departure? His point of departure is summed up in Sakis like this, as I just quoted. So the point is that if everything, and as I quoted a Saki just a while ago, Bhitar Bahar Sabad Nirantar, if there is a kind of consistency between my inner self and outside, if Brahma or Bhagwan or Khuda, whatever you call it, permeates the entire universe, then this whole idea of one particular place being holy and others not being holy, Purab Desa, Arhika, Baka, Pachim Desa, Alha Mukama, he attacks that also. Jore Khudaye Masjid Basate, Aure Mulak Kyun Hera. If God resides in Masjid, he knew that God does not reside in Masjid, but Masjid is a holy place. So why only Masjid is a holy place? Why not the whole world is a holy place? Why only temple is a place of worship? Why not the entire thing is a place of worship? So these are fundamental questions he raises, and which of course irritate people, irritate many people. They irritate people till date. So
We'll be right back after this short break.
$100. That's all it takes to begin your journey with Bitcoin and Ethereum. No, really. With CoinSwitch, you can start investing in over 100 cryptocurrencies with just 100 rupees. On top of that, there are zero charges for deposits and withdrawals, so you can trade, buy, sell, however and whenever you want. All of this, plus their extremely intuitive interface, makes CoinSwitch the perfect app for beginners in the crypto space. But don't take my word for it. Just download CoinSwitch for free and try it out for yourself. If you'd like more information on cryptocurrencies, tune into a show about crypto with me, Rohan Joshi, my new adventure on IVM Podcasts. CoinSwitch, kuch to badlega.
Welcome back to the Wire Talks.
But it is one thing for the establishment to react. Did the common people respond in any significant way by absorbing what he had to say and then practice it in their daily lives?
I would say if you look at everyday practice, instead of going by what is written in normative scriptures and things like that, Siddharth, if you look carefully and critically, as I have tried to do in my book, which you have read, if you look at the everyday practices starting from 15th to 18th, 19th century, I would say yes. Lot of things changed because of the influence of people like Kabir, coupled with the changes in material conditions of society. I mean, just to give you one example, contrary to popular perceptions about Indian history, I mean, it's a very popular and apparently innocuous perception that India has been a land of villages. The fact is, historians have established that in 15th century India was much more urbanized than the contemporary Europe. And in fact, India in 15th and 16th century, in the reign of Akbar and his successors, was much more urbanized than India under British dispensation in 19th century. Economic historians have established it beyond any shadow of reasonable doubt that there was a deliberate attempt to de-urbanize and de-industrialize. So if you keep all this in mind, and if you look at the evidences available from everyday practice, as reflected in the literature of the time, because there is no other evidence we can actually get. So that's why I emphasize on vernaculars. If you look at vernacular literature, then certainly the people like Kabir made a lot of difference, and it showed in everything.
Your contention, therefore, coming back to the earlier point, your contention is that the vernacular tradition and the vernacular literature, even shall we say popular culture in that sense, of that period, pointed to a certain kind of modernity, which in ideas, say perhaps in lifestyles. So therefore, our understanding that the Enlightenment brought us modernity and the ideas of Enlightenment brought us modern thinking, which then got advanced because we learn about that period, we learn about the Renaissance, we learn about even 20th century modernism. But there was already that existing in India in some other way, and that there is no one has a monopoly on this.
Yeah, precisely. When I talk of vernacular modernity or modernity in India before it came in contact with Europe or Britain in particular, let me make it absolutely clear. I am not at all denying the importance of the Enlightenment modernity which came to us through colonization. I am not one of those who believe in some kind of nativism and think that India was a unique place. Yes, India was a unique place like every complex society was and is, but this uniqueness was part of a universal existence. So I want to make it clear again and again that I am not denying the importance of Enlightenment modernity. What I'm arguing for is this, that even before we came in touch with that kind of modernity, we had a body of ideas, a whole complex of practices, if we study, we can see, which reflected the insistence on individuality, which reflected the insistence on rationality, and which insisted on a different kind of conceptualization of relationship between human beings, society, and cosmos. Siddharth, after all, what is modernity? I mean, Max Weber identified two aspects of modernity, two fundamental aspects. One is disenchantment, and the other is desacralization. Things which were considered sacred were challenged in the Enlightenment period. The idea of, to give a very, simple example, the idea of a geocentric world was challenged. That was disenchantment with the given model of the universe and society, the model propagated by church. If you look at Bhakti poetry, particularly this part Nirgun, which means worshipping or associating with a formless God, not with a particular form of God. So if you focus on the sensibility of Nirguna Bhakti, then you realize that this disenchantment, this desacralization, and consequent rational interrogation of everything which exists, that is the crux of modernity. And you can see it there. In my book, I have given a lot of examples, I have given concrete instances, evidences, and in my further work, which I am doing now on basically on Hinduism beyond Sanskrit, I am going to give even more evidences for the argument I am making.
So when did all that change? Not just the perception, but even in terms of, was it under colonial rule? Was it even before that? There was a massive Brahminical and established order reaction. But this notion that, it was a very, very golden era before the Mughals or the Muslim rulers arrived, before the British and colonials arrived, that there was no caste, there was harmony, and that people went about their daily lives and practiced religion, and it was all highly secular and syncretic. But unfortunately, it all changed. But actually, in actual terms, just not the perception, but some changes must have happened as a result of this.
Okay. In the first place, I think that the way we started looking at our past after the arrival of colonial episteme, colonial knowledge system, it has resulted in two views which apparently seem contradictory to each other, but are actually rooted in the colonial way of looking at things. One view is this, that before the British arrived, and in more fashionable these days, the view that before the Muslims arrived, everything was hunky-dory in this society. There were no problems, nothing, no social regression, no violence, nothing. Everybody was happy and God was, everything was fine with world and God was happy in his heaven. So that was the situation according to one view, which to my mind implies that, well, we were not smart enough to solve our problems, but probably we were not even intelligent enough to create our own problems. We had to depend on others even for creating problems for ourselves. So communalism was created by Britishers, Sati Pratha was created by Muslims, untouchability was so this is, to put it very bluntly, is nonsense. The other view, which probably looks at India before Britishers as an area of permanent darkness. There was no ray of hope. Only the British had to come and take this society out of its historical amnesia and bring it to the flow of history. Siddharth, I can only briefly say in this brief conversation that both these views are factually incorrect. Only if you have the patience to look at the sources from Persian, from Sanskrit, from Arabic, and of course the vernaculars, your whole view of Indian history changes. With this preface, so to say, coming to your question, the things started changing almost simultaneously. You are right. On one hand, there was a kind of reaction to this Nirguna Bhakti. There was a backlash from the forces of establishment, both from Brahminical tradition as well as Islamic tradition. I mean, after all, we should not forget that during the reign of Akbar, there was a kind of revolt led by Sheikh Ahmad Sarindi, who declared Akbar virtually to be a kafir, because he was going against the Sharia and Islam, and he was doing all kind of bad things. So similarly, this happened in the context of Hindu tradition, this happened in the context of Islamic tradition. What happened after the arrival of colonial power and along with colonial episteme? That, for example, they studied or they discovered a phenomenon in one particular part of country and projected it as an all India practice, and then made it a part of common sense through education system and through dominance of colonial, or to use contemporary phraseology, metropolitan knowledge. To give you one example, which I have given in this book also and also in detail. I mean, we till our school days studied or were told that Hindus observed a taboo on seafaring. It was considered a pap. It was considered a sin for a Hindu to cross the sea. Okay, all right, they used to do it in ancient times, but after 10th or 12th century, this became a taboo. Now, this is my guess, that they studied Brahmin communities of Eastern India, Bihar and Bengal, which actually observed a taboo on seafaring. And then they kind of imposed this on the whole Hindu community. Conveniently forgetting the fact, I have given facts and references in my book that Banyaj and even non-Banyaj from Marwar, Multan and Gujarat, and I'm not talking of South at all at the moment. We know about South, but I'm not talking of South at all at the moment. Banyaj and non-Banyaj from Gujarat, Multan and Marwar regularly fared the sea, regularly crossed the sea, had business contact as far away as Astrakhan, that is the Russian port city. In fact, I have quoted and I have written, I visited Astrakhan and I published my research come travelogue of Astrakhan in Hindi some years ago. I visited Astrakhan archives. They were called Hindi, irrespective of their religion. Most of them were Hindus in any way, but they were called Hindis. The Hindi merchants had a clout, not only in local political establishment, but even in the court of Tsar in Moscow. And they never converted. They started converting to Orthodox Christianity only in 19th century. From 16th to 18th, early 19th century, they continue to maintain their religious beliefs and practices. So they crossed the sea. And it was not as if once you crossed and settled in Astrakhan and that's over. People used to come back. I have seen the archives indicating these facts. But this was made of common sense. So things started changing first because of the backlash from reactionary forces from within Indian society. And these forces got active support. If you read the work of Nicholas Dirks, he has used a very interesting expression, the official Brahmins. So all kind of regressive and reactionary practices were projected as the authentic tradition. All kind of dissenting voices were projected as some kind of heresy. So it's a very complex process. And again, I would say you can understand the dynamics of this complex process only and only if you look at vernacular sources very carefully and not merely as a translation of Sanskrit or Persian.
So if I were to contemporize it, if I were to bring it to present times, Kabir is inconvenient even to today's imposed way of thinking, the kind of official view of thinking about what India was, what India is, what India should be. And I can't see the present establishment, which is quite blatant in its propagation of a particular kind of Hinduism. I can't see him being popular with them because he challenges their established views. And to put it bluntly, Kabir and Hindutva cannot reconcile.
Well, of course, Hindutva. Let us be very clear. I am sure you are very clear in your mind about it. The fundamental difference between Hinduism and Hindutva. So one is not talking here of Hinduism. Hinduism has been quite accepting of Kabir for last 500 years. It's a different matter how they have accommodated each other. But so far as the so-called traditional or even Brahminical Hinduism is concerned, it has coexisted, happily accepted Kabir. There is no problem. So far as Hindutva is concerned, of course it cannot reconcile with Kabir. Not because Kabir said this or Kabir said that. Not because of that. But because of the fundamental reason that Kabir encourages you, inspires you, in fact challenges you to think for yourself, to think rationally. And like any authoritarian worldview, Hindutva cannot tolerate a human subject exercising his or her moral and intellectual agency. And Kabir encourages you to do precisely that, to think for yourself, to look at your experience, to use your discretion, your wisdom, your vivek. The key word here is vivek. Hindutva is contradictory to the very idea of vivek. Therefore, it will be very uncomfortable with Kabir. It can only pay some lip service to Kabir just as it does pay lip service to Gandhiji. So it can pay some lip service to Kabir. It can project Kabir in a very sanitized way, just as it does with Gandhiji and even with Vivekananda and others. Of course, it cannot really accept Kabir in its totality. So certainly it can.
Your book, therefore, comes at a very opportune time, Purushottam. It reminds us of Kabir and his message of individuality, of how everyone should think independently, and that cannot possibly sit well with the current powerful establishment which wants all Hindus to be part of a larger parivar. Will Indians respond to his message?
Well, I hope so. I cannot say anything for certain, but I hope so. And it is with this hope that one writes a book. And going by the response so far, I think my hope is not unfounded. People are reacting positively. Some people are critical, but criticism is always welcome if it's rational and if it's not motivated by ulterior motives. So, but I hope that people will realize, because Siddharth, I am basically arguing, forget about Hindutva or this or that, forget about all kind of political terminology for a moment. Left, right, let's forget about everything. If you are a human being, then primarily you should be applying your own mind. And also you should be conscious and aware of the fact that your mind does not come out of thin air. It is formed, it is made of a whole 1,000 years old tradition, not only of the culture to which you belong today, but also of the whole world. To give you my favorite example, when Gandhiji was reading Gita, he was not reading Gita merely in tradition which was his. He was reading Gita in a context where he was in constant interaction with the European tradition of knowledge and also of contemporary knowledge. When Martin Luther King was reading Bible in a different way, he was of course reading it in presence of Gandhiji, if not under the influence of Gandhiji. So he had actually transcended his own, quote unquote, own tradition. So we all are like that. And our minds actually work like that. So if we accept that basic fact and forget for a moment our prejudices or our preferences for this or that political worldview, I hope there is still hope. And it is with this hope that I have written this book. Let us see what happens.
May I just say, and this is not necessarily a criticism because it's an erudite book, but may I just say that perhaps a book which approaches the entire idea of Kabir and his work in a slightly more layperson's language may actually be of help. Maybe even separately, maybe even a children's book, a young adult's book, which tells people, because, again, going back to something you said earlier, that when people read the Mahabharata and Ramayana, they're actually doing it for the second time because they've already imbibed some of the ideas and some of the stories. But there are a whole lot of simplistic versions of both books available to the common person. So perhaps that may be a future idea.
Yeah, thank you very much for it. It's a very good suggestion. And in fact, I tried to make this book the same way, not actually young adult, but lay person. That was primarily my focus. But then I realized that I am making a lot of arguments. I am making a lot of proposals which go against the prevalent common sense, both in the academic world as well as outside the academic world. So I decided that I have to have some minimal references, some kind of academic format. If you read my Hindi book, which is the present book is a kind of further advance in the same direction of research. My Hindi book is quite readable, I believe, but it is even much more academic. In fact, one of the critics jokingly commented that it is intimidating. And he actually counted, I never counted, that Purushottam Agarwal has referred to 600 books in this book. I never counted how many books I have referred to. So I can say that considering that Kabir is an improvement in that direction. But for future, I really take your point. It's a very good suggestion. I have been thinking on this line, and maybe it's a very good idea to write a separate Kabir book for young adults or for people who are not part of this whole academic discourse and still would like to know more about Kabir and his ideas and his times. God willing, that Kabir ke Ram ki ichha rahi to ho jayega.
So, it also will perhaps receive, even this will receive a ready-made kind of audience because he's very much part of popular culture. People name their children.
Yeah,
you said that people know instinctively and recall some of his dohas. In the north, you said in the so-called Hindi belt, you said that it's very much part of tradition and people celebrate him. And this is where really the strength lies, isn't it?
Quite right. And you see, as I have commented in this book itself, that Kabir is a real millennium superstar. On one hand, he is very popular amongst the English-speaking metropolitan youth in places like Delhi, Mumbai, even in New York. On the other hand, he is very much part of people like me who come from not exactly a rural or mufassil, but a small town background. And of course, for many people in the rural areas, particularly of Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, he continues to be a virtual deity. He continues to be a devata, a god himself. So yes, you are right. And yes, let me see if I can do that. And if I could really write a book on Kabir, which is aimed at non-specialist, non-academic, but sensitive audience. I'll try to do that, Siddharth. Certainly, I'll try to.
At the same time, may I say that I found your book in the beginning a little heavy going, but once the ideas settled down, I could read it further. Chapter 2 or 3, 2 and 3, and even the one about the Rajput king are quite interesting and enlightening. And thank you very much for making him accessible to our listeners. I think curiosity will only go up, and may it go up in these times of ours.
Thank you, Siddharth.
Yeah, so thank you, Purushottam Agarwal, whose new book on Kabir, which even if you find it a little esoteric, you must not give up because it is really an enlightening book. And we thank you once again for being part of this podcast.
Thank you, Siddharth. It has been really a pleasure. It has been a wonderful experience to be part of this conversation. Thank you very much for organizing.
Yeah. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Wire Talks. Till then, thank you very much. You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Siddharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On the Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast, in the first half, Ashwin is joined by Varun to wrap India's ODI tour of Sri Lanka. In the second half, DJ joins the party to discuss the first T20 international between India and Sri Lanka. If you'd like to hear more about this match, former Indian cricketer Sabah Karim joins Rajiv Mishra on Khel Niti and they talk some more about it. Ladies and gentlemen, we're really excited to announce a new show about crypto with Rohan Joshi. He's going to dive deep and demystify all this crypto stuff that we've been hearing about. And let me tell you a little bit more about stuff that's going on the network really quickly. Congratulations to Maru Kinayat, who celebrates 50 episodes of The Note with a discussion on health as a fundamental right. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam talks to Harsha Chetanwala of mywealthgrow.com. Zarina Poonawalla is starting a new miniseries on emotional intelligence. Do check out the kickoff episode on the Empowering series. And Simplified talks about semiconductors. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show, or any other show for that matter, please do tell a friend. That's really helpful for us. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors on the network this week. They make this all possible. Thank you very much, CET, Cred, Global Victoria, Bank of Baroda, Intuit India, Lenovo, and CoinSwitch Kuber. We really appreciate your support.
Have you ever wondered where the business world is headed? How the ways in which we create, market, and sell to consumers will evolve? Or if we'll ever go back to wearing pants while working? For answers to all of this and more, tune into Advertising is Dead with me, Varun Duggirala. Every Tuesday, as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond. You can catch all episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.